Adrian Kodra and Besnik Hoxha were not ordinary criminals. They were the architects of a shadow empire that stretched from the mountains of Albania to the bustling streets of Europe, rewriting the rules of power, fear, and control along the way. In the early 1990s, Albania was a country in chaos. The fall of the old regime left a vacuum that was quickly filled by uncertainty and fear. Streets were empty at night, banks struggled to operate, and government officials were often powerless to enforce the law. In this environment, ordinary survival often meant bending the rules, but for some, bending the rules became an art form. In the mountains and small villages, a new breed of opportunists began to emerge, learning how to navigate the lawless spaces between towns and borders. They were not the typical criminals seen in newspapers. They were careful, calculating, and patient. Their first ventures were small, stolen goods transported through hidden paths, simple scams that earned them trust among certain villagers, and unspoken alliances with local authorities who turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes. At first, it seemed like nothing more than petty crime, a means to survive in a collapsing society. But within these small acts, a methodical pattern was forming. Those involved understood that loyalty was the most valuable currency. Betrayal meant exile or death, and the consequences were applied swiftly and silently. Fear became a shield that protected their operations, and the lessons learned in the hills of Albania would later define a sophisticated system of crime. They discovered early that power was not measured by how many people feared you, but by how invisible you could remain while still controlling outcomes. The group operated in shadows, often merging with legitimate communities, attending markets and working in trades during the day while planning their operations at night. Their presence was barely noticeable, but their influence was quietly growing. As the group expanded, they began experimenting with larger operations. They discovered that stolen goods could be sold not just in local markets, but across borders. Smuggling routes, once used by farmers and traders, were now adapted for illicit purposes. Mountain paths, river crossings, and abandoned warehouses became part of a hidden network that moved goods and money efficiently and with surprising discretion. Each successful venture reinforced the notion that organization, patience, and discipline could achieve far more than brute force alone. Unlike common street gangs, violence was not their first tool. It was a last resort, applied in a way that left no trace and assured no unnecessary attention from law enforcement. The group's influence grew slowly but steadily. Villagers and local officials alike learned to respect the network's unspoken rules. Everyone understood their place within this emerging system. Small acts of compliance or assistance were rewarded, while disobedience was met with consequences so subtle and quiet that it often left no witnesses. By the end of the decade, the network had laid the foundation for something far more ambitious than petty crime. They had learned how to survive, how to protect their operations, and most importantly, how to expand without exposing themselves to risk. What had begun as opportunistic theft in the shadows of a collapsing country was now evolving into an organized force capable of reaching far beyond. Albania, a force whose patience and cunning would one day allow it to dominate networks across Europe. The success of the network within Albania gave its members the confidence to look beyond their borders. They realized that the chaos of the early 1990s in Europe, with its shifting economies and porous frontiers, presented opportunities far greater than anything they had encountered at home. Their first target was neighboring Greece, a country with bustling ports and a growing demand for goods that could not always be supplied through legal means. The group studied the routes carefully, mapping every road, river, and border crossing. They learned which checkpoints were strict and which were vulnerable, and they observed the routines of border guards and customs officers. Every detail mattered. Each successful crossing was recorded, analyzed, and used to refine the next attempt. Smuggling, once a simple transport of stolen goods, became an operation that required planning, timing, and coordination on a level far beyond local theft. The first attempts were small, almost experimental. Crates of electronics, jewelry, and luxury items were loaded into vehicles with forged documents. The drivers were carefully chosen for their ability to remain calm under pressure and to blend into crowds. They avoided obvious routes and instead used remote passes, often hidden in mountainous regions or coastal areas. Nighttime crossings became a preferred method, reducing the likelihood of detection. At each stage, the network maintained strict secrecy, with operatives knowing only what was necessary for their task. This compartmentalization ensured that if one member were caught, the operation as a whole would remain intact. These early successes were quietly celebrated, not with loud displays of power, but with subtle increases in trust and influence within the group. As their operations expanded into Italy, the network discovered a crucial lesson. Appearances mattered as much as planning. They could not rely on force or intimidation in foreign cities. Instead, they used legitimacy as a shield. Imported goods were transported through legal businesses, sometimes under the guise of construction equipment or shipping containers filled with mundane items. By blending illicit shipments with legitimate trade, they minimized attention and maximized profit. Local authorities often saw nothing more than normal business activity. Each successful delivery strengthened the network's reputation and provided the capital to expand further. The group began to understand that their advantage lay not in chaos, but in order. The more structured their methods, the more resilient they became. The first crossings were also a test of patience and discipline. Mistakes could be fatal. A single wrong decision could alert authorities or rival criminals. Yet the network adapted, learning from errors and adjusting strategies without drawing attention. Over time, they developed a rhythm, a silent code that guided every movement. Couriers, contacts, and middlemen were chosen not only for skill but for loyalty, ensuring that the network remained cohesive even as it stretched across countries. By the time their presence in Greece and Italy was established, the group had transformed from a local band of opportunists into a sophisticated organization capable of operating in foreign lands. What had begun as a risky adventure in smuggling became the blueprint for a wider empire, one that would continue to expand across Europe with stealth, patience, and ruthless efficiency. The first crossings were more than just shipments. They were the first steps toward domination. By the time the network had established itself in foreign countries, it had learned that brute force alone could never build a lasting empire. Violence could gain territory temporarily, but it attracted attention, and attention invited law enforcement. The group realized that their strength lay in precision, organization, and reputation. They began to develop a model of crime that resembled a business more than a gang. Every operation was carefully calculated, every move planned and monitored, and every member given a defined role with strict expectations. Profits were recorded meticulously, and losses were punished quietly, often without leaving evidence or witnesses. This approach created loyalty and fear simultaneously, a combination more powerful than any weapon. It was no longer enough to survive or steal. The network was learning to dominate through discipline and strategy. The structure of the organization was unlike anything seen in local crime scenes. Hierarchies were clear but invisible to outsiders. Leaders remained faceless, issuing orders through intermediaries and couriers. The lower ranks executed tasks without knowing the full picture, ensuring that even if someone was captured or turned informant, the operation could continue. Each member understood that their role was vital, but no one was indispensable. This system created resilience. The network became a machine that could absorb shocks, adapt to challenges, and continue expanding without exposing its core. The idea of loyalty was elevated to an art form. Betrayal was almost unheard of because the consequences were precise and unavoidable, but executed without public spectacle. The network also learned to control markets rather than streets. In each city they entered, they did not engage in random violence or chaos. Instead, They quietly studied supply chains, identifying key points where control would maximize profits. They manipulated shipments, delayed rival deliveries, and secured exclusive contacts with suppliers. By the time a competitor realized what was happening, the network had already taken control of the most profitable routes. This invisible domination allowed them to grow rapidly without sparking open conflict that might alert authorities. Violence was still used, but sparingly and strategically. Assassinations or beatings were calculated moves designed to send messages while remaining untraceable. Fear became a tool of precision rather than a public spectacle. The group also invested in appearances, creating the illusion of legitimate enterprise to outsiders. Businesses were registered, invoices were produced, and some members even attended local social events to blend in. Money was laundered through construction projects, import-export companies, and even restaurants. The combination of legality and secrecy created a perfect cover. To the public and the police, these were ordinary operations, while behind the scenes, the network orchestrated complex schemes that spanned countries. Each move was measured, each step calculated, and each action designed to strengthen the empire quietly and efficiently. Over time, the network evolved into more than a criminal organization. It became a system and intricate web of operations that was difficult to disrupt because no single part could be isolated. The lessons learned in Albania, patience, discipline, loyalty, and precision had been refined into a methodology that allowed the group to dominate markets, intimidate rivals, and evade authorities across Europe. The group was no longer a collection of opportunists. It was a structured, ruthless entity that had discovered a new model of crime, one where organization and strategy were more powerful than guns and intimidation, and where the empire itself mattered more than any individual within it. As the network grew stronger in Greece and Italy, its leaders began looking farther across Europe, recognizing opportunities created by expanding trade, open borders, and booming economies. The network understood that controlling local markets was not enough. Real power came from influence across regions. Safe houses were established in port cities, industrial zones, and even quiet suburbs, providing strategic bases for operations. Each location was carefully selected for its proximity to trade routes, transport hubs, or potential criminal opportunities. No detail was left to chance. The network studied local economies, law enforcement patterns, and rival groups, ensuring that their expansion would be invisible yet unstoppable. Each move was deliberate, part of a broader strategy to dominate supply lines rather than fight for streets. Legal businesses became a crucial tool in their expansion. Shipping companies, construction firms, and even small cafes served as fronts to move goods, clean money, and establish a legitimate presence. These businesses gave the network a shield against suspicion, allowing operations to continue without drawing attention. Shipments could pass as ordinary imports. Bank accounts could handle large transfers without raising alarms, and meetings could occur under the guise of business negotiations. Money flowed freely, disguised as profits, while behind the scenes, the network maintained absolute control. The combination of legal and illegal activity created a dual-layered system. What appeared normal on the surface was actually part of a vast, hidden empire. The network's expansion relied heavily on careful observation and intelligence. Every city had its own dynamics, and the group learned to adapt quickly. Local law enforcement was studied meticulously. Checkpoints, patrol routines, and even corruption patterns were mapped and exploited. By understanding the weaknesses in each system, the network could move goods, people, and money efficiently. Rival gangs were handled with subtlety rather than violence at first. The network would infiltrate, bribe, or outmaneuver competitors, ensuring dominance without attracting public attention. This approach minimized risk and maximized profit, allowing operations to grow faster than rivals could react. Europe's growing trade networks offered new possibilities. Containers at ports, international trucking routes, and cross-border warehouses became part of the network's infrastructure. By integrating into legitimate supply chains, the network could move massive amounts of goods, drugs, stolen electronics, and counterfeit products without detection. The empire's reach expanded quietly, and the group's presence was felt only in the gaps of commerce: missing shipments, delayed deliveries, and competitors who mysteriously failed. By the time authorities noticed patterns, the network had already moved on, leaving no trace but profit. Perhaps the most important factor in this expansion was discipline. Leaders enforced strict protocols for communication, movement, and accountability. Couriers were chosen for reliability, not loyalty alone, and every transaction was recorded internally to prevent mistakes. Mistakes were rare, and when they occurred, they were corrected immediately and quietly. The network's ability to maintain secrecy while growing in size and scope became its greatest weapon. While Europe celebrated trade and openness, the empire quietly wove itself into the continent's commerce, setting the stage for unprecedented influence. By combining legal businesses, strategic intelligence, and calculated discretion, the network transformed from a local criminal group into a transnational force, showing that patience and precision could achieve what violence alone never could. The empire was no longer hidden in shadows. It had entered Europe's mainstream economy, invisible yet unstoppable, a silent ruler of markets and routes that spanned borders. As the network's influence spread across Europe, rival criminal groups began to notice the quiet but unyielding presence of this Albanian organization. Unlike typical gangs, the network did not fight for territory with public displays of violence or bloody turf wars. Instead, it waged a war that was invisible to the untrained eye, a war for control of routes, supply chains, and networks that others depended on. By manipulating logistics, delaying shipments, or quietly intercepting rivals' operations, the group gained dominance without ever drawing direct attention to itself. Competitors often blamed bad luck or administrative errors when their shipments failed or profits disappeared, unaware that they were being systematically outmaneuvered by a shadowy force that remained almost untouchable. The network's approach was meticulous. Each city, each port, each industrial area was treated as a chessboard. Every courier, every transaction was monitored and controlled. The group identified choke points in distribution and supply lines, places where influence could be exerted with minimal risk. Rivals who had previously relied on these same points suddenly found themselves blocked, delayed, or forced to pay for access. At first, these disruptions were subtle, dismissed as unfortunate coincidences or bureaucratic inefficiency. But as patterns became undeniable, the competitors realized they were facing a calculated and intelligent adversary, not random misfortune. One of the most striking aspects of this invisible war was the network's strategic use of fear. Violence was employed not recklessly, but with precision. Assassinations, kidnappings, or sudden disappearances of key figures were carefully orchestrated to send unmistakable messages to others who might challenge the network. These acts were executed in a way that left no witnesses or evidence, maintaining the illusion of invisibility. By avoiding public chaos and unnecessary attention, the organization assured that law enforcement and the media remained unaware of its true scale. Its power grew quietly, spreading through economic and logistical control rather than through brute force alone. The network also excelled at infiltration and co-option. Contacts within local industries, law enforcement, and political systems were cultivated to gather intelligence, avoid arrests, and secure safe passage for shipments. Bribes were strategic, partnerships calculated, and alliances temporary but effective. Through these subtle manipulations, the group extended its influence without overt conflict, turning cities, ports, and businesses into extensions of its operations. By the time authorities began to notice irregularities, it was too late. The network had already embedded itself into the infrastructure of trade and commerce. The invisible war created confusion among rivals. Competing groups attempted to retaliate, but often failed because they could not identify the true source of their setbacks. Traditional methods of fighting for territory were ineffective against a group that controlled systems rather than streets. By staying one step ahead, the network expanded its reach across multiple countries simultaneously. Its strategy proved that true dominance did not require visible power but precise, calculated, and disciplined control over the mechanisms that mattered most: logistics, communication, and information. In this way, the Albanian network became more than a criminal group. It became an unseen force, reshaping Europe as a illicit economy and demonstrating that the most dangerous power is often the one you cannot see. With success came pressure, and the very growth that had made the network formidable began to reveal cracks in its armor. The empire had expanded rapidly across Europe, establishing safe houses, legal fronts, and complex supply chains. But the larger it became, the more difficult it was to maintain absolute control. Internal tensions began to surface. Members who had once been loyal out of necessity or fear started to see opportunities for personal gain. Greed and ambition crept into the ranks, creating subtle fractures in a system that had relied so heavily on discipline and trust. Leaders recognized the danger early, but even their meticulous planning could not completely prevent human error. One misstep could, and often did, threaten the entire operation. The first major warning came when a trusted courier disappeared along with sensitive records. For the network, this was more than just a lost shipment. It was a breach of the very structure that held the empire together. The records contained details of transactions, identities of key operatives, and the locations of safe houses. Panic could have spread among the lower ranks, but the leadership responded with cold efficiency. Operations were immediately compartmentalized even further, and branches that were potentially exposed were cut off and isolated. Communication lines were rerouted, and the few members aware of the full situation were tightly controlled. Simultaneously, law enforcement in multiple countries began coordinating investigations. Arrests started occurring in Italy, Greece, and Germany, signaling that authorities were beginning to piece together patterns that had previously gone unnoticed. The network's leadership recognized that they were being watched more closely than ever. In response, they enacted drastic measures. Entire operations were abandoned overnight, safe houses emptied, and assets moved in ways designed to erase any trace of their existence. Money was laundered rapidly through alternate channels, leaving investigators with only partial evidence and few leads. Members who were suspected of potential betrayal were quietly removed or reassigned, demonstrating that the network's survival depended on ruthless, immediate action. The internal cracks also highlighted the limitations of trust. Even the most loyal members could make mistakes under pressure or act out of self-interest. Leaders instituted new protocols to minimize reliance on any single individual, further compartmentalizing tasks and reducing the risk of exposure. Couriers no longer knew full routes, accountants never had access to operational details, and even middle managers were kept in the dark about strategic decisions. These measures created friction within the group, but were necessary to preserve the empire's core. By the end of this turbulent period, the network had survived, but not without a cost. Profits had been temporarily disrupted, some members were lost, and the empire had been forced to operate at a lower profile. The experience, however, strengthened its adaptability. Leaders realized that expansion and secrecy were delicate balances, and that the empire could never afford complacency. The cracks in the system had been painful but instructive, teaching the network that vulnerability came not just from outside forces, but from within. What remained was a more cautious, disciplined, and ruthless organization, one capable of weathering crises while continuing to expand. In the world of organized crime, survival required constant vigilance, and the Albanian network had just proven it could endure even when the ground beneath it threatened to collapse. After surviving the internal upheavals and law enforcement crackdowns, the network entered a new phase of evolution. The leaders, having learned the dangers of visibility and centralized authority, chose to step further into the shadows. Decisions that once filtered through a few high-ranking members were now executed through multiple layers of separation, making it nearly impossible to identify the true sources of command. Orders were given indirectly, relayed through intermediaries, and trusted operatives who themselves were unaware of the broader strategy. This system of compartmentalization ensured that even if one part of the network was compromised, the core remained untouched. No single arrest, no single betrayal could dismantle the empire, and this structural invisibility became its greatest strength. The network's shift toward anonymity transformed its operations. Leaders avoided appearing in public, even in legal business dealings, allowing frontline managers and local coordinators to act as buffers. Couriers, accountants, and intermediaries executed instructions with minimal knowledge of the full picture. This reduced risk, but required extreme discipline at every level. Training and selection became more stringent, with loyalty, reliability, and discretion prioritized above all else. Members who failed to meet these standards were quietly removed, often without explanation, reinforcing a culture where errors could be fatal and trust was earned through flawless execution. This invisibility also altered the network's approach to expansion. It no longer relied solely on controlling shipments or routes. It became a system that could replicate itself. New branches were established in different countries under the guidance of operatives, who had little connection to the original leadership. Each branch followed strict protocols, but no individual outside the leadership fully understood the entire operation. This decentralization allowed the network to grow rapidly while remaining insulated from outside forces. Authorities often encountered fragments of the organization, but could not identify or target its core. Each investigation yielded clues, but never a full picture, frustrating law enforcement and allowing the network to continue expanding almost undetected. The network's influence also extended through financial and economic channels. Legal businesses were used to launder money, obscure ownership, and fund new operations. Investments were diversified across industries and countries, providing both cover and profit. Through these legal enterprises, the network exerted subtle influence on markets, suppliers, and competitors. Its presence was almost ghost-like, felt everywhere but seen by few. Law enforcement and rival groups alike struggled to adapt to this form of power, which relied on organization, secrecy, and influence rather than open violence. By removing the visibility of leadership, the empire became almost untouchable. The concept of a single head or figure of authority ceased to exist. Instead, it operated as a self-sustaining system. Patterns of behavior, protocols, and loyalty mechanisms were institutionalized, ensuring that the network could survive disruptions, internal conflicts, or external pressure. This shift in structure marked the network's transformation from a criminal group into an enduring machine of organized crime. Its power was no longer tied to individuals, but to the system itself, a system designed to adapt, expand, and survive. By becoming invisible, the empire had learned perhaps its most valuable lesson. The true strength of a criminal organization lies not in its leaders, but in its ability to operate independently of them silently and relentlessly across borders and time. Years passed, and the empire that had begun in the shadows of Albania had grown into a vast, transnational network whose influence stretched across Europe. By now, law enforcement agencies had taken notice. Headlines reported arrests, raids, and seizures, creating the impression that authorities were finally gaining the upper hand. Public perception suggested that the empire was weakening, that justice was closing in. Yet the truth was far more complex. The network had anticipated these challenges and adapted with remarkable efficiency. Arrests, seizures, and trials affected only peripheral members and low-level operations, while the core of the organization remained untouched, continuing its activities under new names, new routes, and new faces. The empire had learned to survive in the public eye without revealing its true structure or strength. Despite the pressure, the network maintained a remarkable ability to evolve. Each crisis was met with swift, calculated responses. Branches were abandoned or relocated, shipments rerouted, and intermediaries replaced seamlessly. Money that had been frozen or seized was often replaced through alternative channels, and assets were dispersed across multiple jurisdictions to reduce risk. This adaptability made the empire resilient to law enforcement efforts that might have crippled other organizations. Even when investigators pieced together fragments of the network, the larger system remained obscured, operating beyond the reach of conventional policing. The network's ability to blend legality with criminality, to hide in plain sight, had become its defining characteristic. The empire's resilience was also a product of its culture of secrecy and loyalty. Members who remained within the system understood that mistakes could be fatal, yet the consequences were rarely public. Trust was earned through discipline, performance, and absolute discretion. Those who failed or disobeyed were quietly removed or reassigned, ensuring the stability of the core structure. Even when faced with betrayals or internal greed, the leadership was able to neutralize threats efficiently, reinforcing the notion that the system itself was more important than any individual within it. This culture ensured continuity. The empire could lose people, face setbacks, and endure law enforcement scrutiny without collapsing. What remained most unsettling, however, was the empire's silent dominance. Unlike other criminal organizations whose power was visible through violence or public spectacle, this network controlled markets, routes, and operations almost invisibly. Competitors, authorities, and the public often only saw the consequences of its actions: missing shipments, disrupted supply chains, or sudden collapses of rival operations without understanding the source. By the time patterns were identified, the network had already adapted, moved, or replaced its key components. The empire had mastered the art of operating beneath the radar, making it nearly untouchable despite its scale. Ultimately, the story of this Albanian network does not have a traditional ending. There was no dramatic arrest of the mastermind, no public dismantling of the organization. The empire did not fall. It transformed. New names replaced old ones, new routes replaced exposed ones, and new operatives filled vacancies left by arrests or retirements. The network's survival demonstrated a simple but chilling truth. Criminal organizations that operate as systems rather than individuals can adapt faster than law enforcement, leaving no final conclusion. The empire's story is a lesson in patience, discipline, and strategy, a reminder that while arrests and headlines may come and go, the shadows where crime thrives often remain unbroken, quietly evolving and expanding across borders.